89.1 FM Rich Radio Hashtag Surmount Kalangitan Ka-Heaven.
Hello everyone! Mabuhay, mapayapang araw po sa ating lahat. A great day to all senior high school learners of Calanitan High School. I hope you guys are having an awesome day and welcome to another virtual learning session. I'm your Sir Mel Santos, broadcasting via our own radio station, 89.1 FM Rich Radio, hashtag Surmount Kalangitan, Ka-Heaven. I hope you are all ready for another study session right at the comforts of our homes as together we will embark on another learning journey in 21st century literature from the Philippines and the world. Now have your paper and pen handy for note-taking along with your self-learning module as we are about to engage in another literary adventure. So set your mind and heart, have yourselves feeling at ease and focused to get the most out of learning from today's topic. On this episode, we will explore literary traditions and forms from different cultures, which will be a 7-part series of virtual learning. For this first episode, we will be discussing the connection between literature and culture and how literature evolved from the contemporary period to 21st century period in relation to evolving world literary culture. But before we proceed, let's keep in mind our learning goals for the entire 7-part series of this virtual learning. First, identify the 21st century literary traditions and forms of different cultures, notably Chinese, Japanese, Indian, African, American, and English literatures. Distinguish the differences of these 21st century literary traditions and forms of different cultures from their established or classical literary convention, and appreciate the 21st century literary developments of different cultures. So these learning goals can be achieved by listening attentively to our discussion, as well as by reading and answering the activity sheets on your self-learning module. And if you have questions, you can reach me out at my personal Facebook Messenger account. So mga ka-heaven, let's get started to roll. Literature and culture seem to be inseparable from each other. Culture is, for the most part, what constitutes the subject of literature in the broad spectrum. People is what constitutes culture, and culture is the main reason that gives sense to literature in general. In our previous lessons, we had come to know the various 21st century representative texts and authors across the continents from Asia to Africa, and we recognize by now that their masterpieces, for the most part, had been greatly influenced by how they were brought up, by their ethnicity, by where they were born, and as such, by the culture they had lived and continue to live by, that had in many ways established their niche or their distinct identity as writers or as important figures of world literature. Their gift or their impeccable talent in writing almost comes secondary from how they integrate their own culture to their masterpieces that made them as formidable as they are in the field of world literature. And as what I have mentioned in our previous module, how they added color and meaning to and a deeper understanding of humanity in general. It is because of the writer's ability to integrate their own culture to their story that has set forth that compelling impact to us audience or readers, and that led us to a deeper understanding and appreciation of their distinct cultures, thus the understanding of humanity in general. We become more tolerant or inclusive in our thinking as we look at various cultures through the lens of literature. Indeed, despite the diversity of cultures, it unifies us through the understanding and appreciation of it all when we explore them through literature. Like how Tan Tuan Eng of Malaysia in his novel The Gift of Rain had shown us a glimpse of Malaysia circa 1939 and the 16-year-old boy protagonist in the story, who was with mixed nationality of Chinese and British, that made him feel alienated from his own beloved Malaysia where he was brought up. As we journey with him trying to overcome such feeling of alienation that runs across his being, it also mirrored the bigger picture of the struggle of Malaysia being alienated by its own land brought about by the terror of World War II. And that subtle, unrequited love of the young boy developed over a Japanese spy who was in the guise of a diplomat that led to this young boy's very first experience of being betrayed, just like how Malaysia itself had brought itself of being betrayed and savagely invaded as a result of the World War II. It was in this novel we saw the cultural complexities that pervaded in Malaysia at the time and that made us feel the horrors of World War II in a different light through the poignant and fragile life of a boy torn between alienation and betrayal. Or how Jitha Yil of India triggered our senses in his novel Narcopolis. It's as if we were there in the novel, and we could almost feel the compelling, squalid conditions brought about by the chaotic culture of drug use and abuse during the 1970s in Bombay, India. Or how Nadine Gordimer of Africa made us understand at a deeper and more meaningful level the social, moral, and racial issues in South Africa under apartheid rule in her novel, The Burger's Daughter. Alright, just a bit of info if you are wondering what apartheid rule is. It is a kind of legislation or enforced law in Africa in the 1940s in which it essentially entailed segregating or separating black people from white people. So it was a racist type of law. Under apartheid, non-white South Africans, which is the majority of the population, were forced to live in separate areas from whites and use separate public facilities. Contact between the two groups had been heavily controlled as well. It was in this era we have come to know Nelson Mandela, as he was the main figure at the time who fought against this twisted racial segregation. He was imprisoned for 27 years, and while in prison, it was said that Nelson Mandela read in secret this novel of Gordimer. Indeed, it is in literature we get to have a better understanding of one's culture, even when it's portrayed in the genre of fiction, even when we know it's not a real story of real people and events, that it is just a product of the writer's imagination. It is through these works of fiction we ironically understand better or deeper the complexities and intricacies of a certain culture. Simply because literature mimics life, it mirrors what is real, painted in a more meaningful way like a work of art that transports us to an alternate world, whether it depicts our own reality or totally different from ours, it brings us there towards a deeper understanding of our own realities or the various cultures that defines the diverse identities of people and humanity in general. It is for the same reason that this time we will be looking at the 21st century or the emergent literary traditions and forms of the cultures of various nationalities or societies in the canons of world literature. When we say 21st century, it is the time we live in which the starting point is the year 2001. As we move forward with time, literature also evolves based on the changes or development of one's culture. It never stayed stagnant, and as what I have mentioned, Literature and culture are inseparable, so when one's culture evolves, so is literature. And we see the proliferation of emergent literary traditions and forms, or even re-emergence of classical or established forms, but in a new light that is in sync with the social atmosphere of the present time. Again, when we say emergent, these are forms that are in process of establishing itself as the new conventions or traditions in world literature. They are like budding flowers awaiting its full bloom. But before we even talk about what are these 21st century or emergent literary forms of different cultures, let's talk about what culture is first. We all know that literature uses language as a means to shape an image, to reflect social life and express the author's thoughts and feelings. And with the telling of these stories in literature, these authors' thoughts and feelings are often embodied in what we call culture, that gives shape or sense or meaning to the story itself. It's the culture established in a literary work that forms its soul. Culture is a social and historical phenomenon. It is the product of long-term creation that leads to culmination of a set of beliefs, customs, values, and activities of a particular group of people at a particular time. So, culture is a social phenomenon because it is essentially the product of practices from life experiences itself that led to a set of beliefs, customs, and values. Culture is a historical phenomenon because it involves a process in itself before it is fully formed. So, when we say process, it's always associated with time, with a course of time. I mean, to carry out a certain process, you will need time, right? Before the process gets to be accomplished or completed. And so it is a long term creation, meaning culture does not happen overnight. It is a process that happens over a period or course of time. And as culture is established and as it develops, it carries out these process through actual life experiences itself. A culture is not a culture, or it will never be established or formed when it is not lived or experienced. It should be practiced and tested over a course of time among group of people. This is the reason why it is almost impossible that writers will not think about their own culture, their own customs and beliefs that they have lived by or led to their upbringing when they begin to write a literary piece. A writer's culture is always on the table when they go through the process of weaving a story or a work of literature. Hence, a literary work of art written by an individual may reflect the culture in which he was born. Therefore, it is important to consider cultural context of a work of art. Cultural values changes as time changes, and these reflects in the works of literature produced in that period, which is the same reason why literature and culture are inseparable. Literature and culture are correlated because when we talk about the culture, the literature can also appear unconsciously. As literature is composed of feelings, emotions, and thoughts, similarly, the culture is composed of thoughts, feelings, and emotions. Literary and cultural studies give us access to historical and emergent traditions of literature, culture, and thought. Literary and cultural studies give us access to historical and emergent traditions of literature, culture, and thought. And speaking of historical, let's take a look first the forms and traditions, or in short, the culture in literature from the contemporary period to 21st century period. So we will be looking at both of these most recent periods of world literature according to how one evolved to another in relation to the actual events of both times and the traces of culture that pervaded during both periods of world literature. So, more often than not, literature almost always mirrors the history of a certain period, the kind of life, the life people lived at the time, and the culture that prevailed that led their life. Personally, I often regard literature, particularly the classics of fiction, as the history of ordinary people the history of how life was lived on an everyday basis, the most intimate moments of their lives lived in a certain era or period. It is through the works of literature you get to see how life of ordinary people was lived in the past. It is in literature you somehow get to experience the mood and nostalgia of the past, the most intimate feelings and actuations of people of a certain period we could only see in the works of literature. Alright, so let's now discuss the developments of literature from the contemporary period to 21st century period in relation to culture. So, contemporary period pertains to the development of world literature that began in the 1940s, specifically after World War II. So, in this period, the milestones that occurred or the features that prevailed in the field of literature in general are the following. First, it leaned towards more on reality based stories with strong characters and a believable story. So, contemporary period of literature is regarded to have harnessed the essence of what we call literary realism. Just a quick clarification on literary realism. So, realism should not be confused with literary nonfiction. We all know that nonfiction refers to factual literature, right? Real events or based on evidences, such as in academic writing or journalism. But realism is not the same as nonfiction. Realism is still a genre which falls under fiction. It is primarily a literary technique or style in writing that tries to portray details in a story that we can discern as familiar, that we have seen happen, or it is possible to occur in real life. A fictional story that looks real, that is realism, or it mimics the way certain things are in real everyday life. So, literary realism is like a fictional story that looks real, or it mimics the way certain things are in real everyday life. According to definition given at masterclass.com, literary realism is a literary movement that represents reality by portraying ordinary or mundane everyday experiences as they are in real life. It depicts familiar people, places, and stories primarily about the middle and lower classes of society. So you see right there that it tries to portray ordinary everyday experiences as they are exactly in real life, primarily about the middle or lower classes, or in other words, the masses. Those things that we do as ordinary people, such as our routine in a day of waking up, then going on errands of our work or at home, or even the simplest moment of eating our lunch or our chill moments over a cup of coffee. Those seeming uneventful or ordinary events in our life are exactly what we can see in the genre of literary realism. It attempts to represent a subject matter truthfully, avoiding speculative fiction and supernatural elements, or even romanticizing them like what we see in our favorite movies or teleseries or K dramas. In realism, it presents a subject matter exactly how it could happen in real life. When you compare realism from romanticism, using how we take selfies, in realism, it's like the no filter thing, taking selfies without filter, while romanticism is like the selfie that made use of filter. It is the same exact picture, but somehow in romanticism or that selfie that made use of filter, it's like an attempt to escape from reality. It's like showing reality in an enhanced or improved version. Realism, on the other hand, is the picture that is unfiltered or unedited. Realism sometimes goes to the great lengths of capturing the exact moment, even the timing itself, such as if it takes 20 minutes for a certain scene to take place in real life, say a character walking to a certain location, that would exactly be the time you would have to bear watching him walk until the character reaches his destination. Somehow, realism tries to be so objective, factual, or even so realistic that writers of this type of literary genre would really take time giving exposure, the way they are, and even how long it takes in real life. Even the scene or moment being captured is just so mundane or ordinary, or just uneventful and routinary, you would see them unfold the way they exactly are in real life. In our country, realism nowadays is often reflected in indie films. A lot of you may already be aware what indie films are, but indie films are the type of films that are produced outside major film studio system, and these kinds of films are often low budget and their distribution is quite limited. One Filipino filmmaker I personally noticed who is so indulgent with realism technique is Love Diaz, who is known for slow-moving cinema. That his film would really take time showcasing a certain slice of life quite indulgently or with prolonged exposure, even when nothing is much happening in the scene, such as, say, a character just staring at blank from afar without emotions at all. So, during the contemporary period of literature, which was the time when World War II ended, writers had leaned towards unleashing the horrors of war, wherein genocide, the atom bomb, and the rise of the communism were just some of the issues expressed in both fiction and nonfiction forms of literature at the time. Genocide is the systematic killing of Jews by the German Nazis led by Adolf Hitler during World War II, which ended in a death toll of about 6 million Jews. The atom bomb is the bombing in Hiroshima, Japan, towards the end of the World War II, which caused widespread destruction and killed between 90,000 and 166,000 people. And the rise of communism, or when the Cold War began, when rivalry developed after World War II between the United States and the Soviet Union, now Russia, and their respective allies. But of course, the contemporary period of literature did not only settle on one side of the spectrum. Remember that it was also during this period magical realism emerged, as discussed in our previous module. It was also during the onset of contemporary period some authors and playwrights promoted existential philosophies. Existential philosophy is a philosophy in which the individual faces a meaningless or absurd world, essentially emphasizing on individual existence, freedom, and choice. So there they are, the virtues of individual existence, freedom, and choice, were essentially the themes or virtues that were deprived to be expressed or experienced during the Second World War, and the sentiment of meaningless existence that pervaded at which time, as it is one of the darkest times of human history. Apparently, the people at the time had become sentimental of these virtues, that only after the war they had a sort of chance to express or release those repressed emotions that they have kept to themselves or that they felt no control over during the time of war. So, contemporary period was sort of the catharsis phase from the horrors of war. Again, we have come across already what catharsis is in our previous module, right? Catharsis is the release of pent-up emotions to our relief. That act of pouring out your emotions, leading to a sigh of satisfaction. One literary work at the time that had conveyed an existential kind of philosophy is the novel Stranger by Albert Camus, which was published around 1946. Camus explored what he termed the nakedness of man faced with the absurd or meaninglessness. When we say absurd, it refers to having no meaning or being devoid of meaning. This prevalence of this ideology during the contemporary period can somehow be attributed to the era of World War II that came before, which was apparently believed to be the most meaningless event of our time. Thus, the expression or release or catharsis of such sentiment in various literary forms that defined, for the most part, the contemporary period of literature, in which one of its prevalent themes was about the absurdity of life or the meaninglessness of existence, a philosophy that emerged from the horrors of World War II. So again, The Stranger is a perfect example of this ideology, called existentialism, that absurdity or meaninglessness of existence altogether without freedom. The story has a quite simple plot in which the main character has an indifferent attitude, such as feeling nothing for the loss of his mother and the random murder he committed for no reason. So, this novel is not difficult to read, but the themes are apparently quite complex and true to its nature of absurdity, or that conveys an existential kind of philosophy. Contemporary literature in general is also known for its second feature of having a well defined, realistic, and with high developed characters with depiction of harsh environments. One example that manifested this feature is the novel Hiroshima by John Hershey. Hershey blended fiction writing techniques to his nonfiction recount of the events of six survivors after the atomic bomb destroyed Hiroshima. So this novel is like it connects history of real events with the power of fictional storytelling. Contemporary period of literature is also known for its character-driven stories. An example of this is the novella The Little Prince. By the way, novella is another literary form which basically a short version of novel but longer than a short story. So anyway, The Little Prince is apparently a character-driven fairy tale of a prince by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, who drew on his experiences in the Sahara Desert to write this fairy tale that featured a pilot who encounters a young prince visiting Earth. The story's themes of loneliness, friendship, love, and loss make the book universally admired and appropriate for all ages. So you see in this example that again, although it is a work of fiction, it had still been drawn or based on real life experiences of the author himself, which somehow still reflects the kind of life at the time, the culture that existed at the time. And again, even when it is a fairy tale, it reflects the use of magical realism genre, which we have discussed in our previous module as an emergent genre during the contemporary period. Again, in this example, it is a fairy tale, but it made use a substantial amount of realistic details that blurred the line between fantasy and reality, or the fantasy elements blended with the natural familiar world. Related to character-driven stories that prevailed during the contemporary period is also the emergence of autobiographical accounts such as The Glass Menagerie, which is an autobiographical memory play by Tennessee Williams, featuring Williams himself as Tom. Another literary work that was written in autobiographical style was The Diary of a Young Girl, Anne Frank, which was written by Anne Frank herself as she was in hiding for 2 years with her family during the Nazi occupation of the Netherlands. So it was a diary written during the Holocaust period, which is one of the darkest, if not the darkest days of World War II. Again, Holocaust is basically the genocide or the mass killings, the massacre of all European Jews by the German Nazis led by Adolf Hitler. Anne Frank was captured in 1944 and sent to a concentration camp where she died of typhoid. Her diary was found and given to her father Otto Frank, the family's only known survivor. It was first published in 1947 and translated into English in 1952. So all of these examples of literary works were again written and published during the 1940s, the era that was riddled by the horrific memories of war that defined the contemporary period of literature. Apparently, during contemporary period of literature, it predominantly reflected political, social, and personal issues with themes of personal cynicism or hopelessness, disillusionment and frustrations, as well as skepticism or disbelief in the existence of God and lack of faith in the traditional institutions brought about by post-World War II era. So again, as what I have mentioned, it is probably the suppressed emotions from the same issues that were not freely expressed during the war, that only after the war that these themes emerged or had become prevalent as a form of catharsis or release of such pent-up emotions from the horrors of war that had been long kept inside, and only after the war that catharsis had been made possible to take place. So you see right there that the literary works of the contemporary period was based on World War II. The sentiments over the horrors of war, which was a culture of terror that developed and persisted for a certain period of time. And again, the catharsis from the twisted culture at the time of war was made prevalent from various works of literature, post-war period, or the so-called contemporary period of literature. And so the contemporary period was a period of society starting to get restored or settled in a more peaceful century, gradually leading to the acceptability of literature of all types, a new heights of development of literature from reality-based type of contemporary literature, often with dark themes, to a more diverse one come the 21st century period of literature. And again, as discussed in our previous module, 21st century literature is defined for its acceptability of all types of literature. It is the most diverse era in literature, or the most inclusive of all types, particularly the steep increase of acceptability of speculative fiction, which we have discussed in great detail in our previous module. The advent or the progressive development of ICT, or information and communications technology, has also prompted the rapid development in world literature, such as the emergence of new genres which include hyperpoetry, blogs, chick lit, graphic and illustrated novels, doodle fiction, and among others that were already covered in your previous modules. So these new genres generally harness ICT as medium or tool in the emergence of these new genres. Alright, so those are essentially the considerable differences between these two recent periods in literature, the contemporary and the 21st century periods. And apparently, we could certainly see what cultures prevailed during both of these periods just by looking at various literary works of these times. Alright, that ends the first of the 7-part series of virtual learning on 21st century literary traditions and forms from different cultures. See you on the next episode, and bye for now mga kaheben!
89.1 FM Rich Radio #Surmont Kalamitan Kaheben